It's a pleasure to be here today. And actually, as a quick reminder, for those of you who haven't voted yet, today's election day, at least here in California. So please get out and vote if you haven't. I plan to, I think, raise more questions than provide answers. Some of these questions, I think, will be familiar to many of you, but some of them perhaps not. And that's where I hope to have some value. Let me just start with a very simple statement, which is that artificial intelligence is a general purpose technology. But even more so, it's a dual use technology, which means from a traditional definition point of view, it's a technology that can be used for both civilian and military applications. But of more relevance here, and from the world of biosecurity, one defines dual-use technologies as those that may be intended to provide benefits, but can be reasonably anticipated to cause harm when misapplied. So about 50 years ago, down the coast here in Asilomar, California, there was a gathering of about 250 scientists who happened to be pretty much the entire world's complement of scientists who were aware of and capable of undertaking a new technology known as recombinant DNA engineering. And they gathered in order to provide a risk-benefit assessment of this new technology. They pondered this question for about 3 or 4 days, at the end of which they decided that the most appropriate course of action would be a moratorium on their technology. They would hold off on fully deploying it until there'd been an opportunity for a better assessment of both benefits and potential risks. And that's what happened over the next several years. The US government and other governments began to examine this technology and in the end came up with guidelines in the form of recombinant DNA guidelines that we now still use, promulgated by the NIH. This kind of model, though, is something that was possible in a world in which all possible executors of a technology could gather together in one place. And that, of course, is not a world that we live in today. Because with something like artificial intelligence, the technology is widely proliferated and widely rolled out and available to many users. And the role of the public in such a dialogue, which, by the way, was not a prominent feature here in Asilomar, is something that is of paramount importance today. By the way, the namesake of this room, Paul Berg, is in that left photograph at the far right. And so it's perhaps not surprising, for this reason and others, that we have simply failed to come together and provided and conducted a holistic and adequate risk-benefit assessment of the impact of artificial intelligence on both science and medicine, and I would argue especially on the risk side. Now, this week and many of your lives are all about discovering the potential benefits of this technology, and I don't pretend or have time to go into the many examples. In my own field of microbiology, we have studies like this one that show the power of a model that's trained on the possible antibiotic properties of small peptides and then used to examine the third domain of life, a world of life that we have very little understanding of, the so-called archaea, and comes up with a number of possible truly novel and potentially important new antibiotics. And likewise in medicine, many examples of potential benefit. The results of this study have already been highlighted here this morning. What I would suggest, though, is that these presentations of benefits and consideration of benefits have not been fully balanced and properly calibrated against the reality, and the risks have not been properly scoped. And so we end up with somewhat overhyped language on the benefits. And I don't want to point fingers at all here, but you'll recognize a number of these quotes, and some of them may be yours, and they're understandable. Things like, clinical AI increasingly resembles clinicians, or AI represents an incredible opportunity, or clinical AI will expand access to care. and pardon the editorial comment that sits next to it. All we simply need to do, say some, is to ensure competency and clinical performance. Now, the problem here is that these assessments of possible benefit have not been calibrated against the important role that clinicians, healthcare providers, serve in conducting what is really a humanistic activity, the engagement of one human being with another human being. And the risks of damage to that process are something that we have not talked about much here this morning. We have these wishful notions that perhaps once the clinician is relieved of this mountain on the left of burdensome administrative tasks, that the provider will now have the free and available time to establish oversight of AI, to restore their presence at the bedside, and now somehow govern a process which is largely still a black box, as you have just heard. And again, these potential problems or challenges ignore this humanistic aspect of medicine, which I still believe is one of the most important aspects of a healing endeavor. Now, this problem of trying to understand risk also applies in the science world, especially now with AI. And here the bias is not so much sort of an optimism bias. It's a over excessive reliance on prior beliefs. In infectious disease, my field, we have hundreds or even thousands of years of experience that would suggest that Mother Nature might be the only and certainly the best deployer of harm through the use of biology. And it's sometimes very difficult to counter this narrative based upon so much long-standing history. We have these 50 years that I've alluded to of advancement and acceleration in biological technologies. And I think we are still grappling with the implications of what these technologies now allow and make possible, and what the answer to this question is, which we've struggled with in my field for the last 10 or 20 years. And you've seen it playing out in the debate about the origin of COVID, or about the wisdom of certain kinds of biological tools that have unusual abilities to cause harm. There are growing numbers of examples of this, including on the top left, the ability of an AI model to, when trained on toxicity, to come up with new nerve-like agents that would be more powerful than something like VX. On the bottom left, AI models that can teach MIT undergraduates who are not science majors how to acquire a potential pandemic agent, and importantly, how to develop it if one's not skilled oneself. This provided information on how to outsource the acquisition. And on the right, the possibility of essentially poisoning the medical literature with deliberate efforts to interject malicious abstracts that skew the results of searches. And the list goes on and on. We now have models that speak in genomic language, if you will, and they have clear, huge potential benefit. This is a model actually developed here at Stanford by Brian He, but also potential downside. Now, Brian He showed that he could develop novel bacterial viruses with this genome language model that could be proven to be fully functional in the laboratory and counter, for example, that antibiotic resistance problem that I alluded to. And he reassures us that he would never have trained his model on human viruses because, of course, that might have led to a human virus that we might not wish to see. Well, who's to say that others might choose differently? And of course, the growing likelihood that science will be outsourced to a machine in what are called automation labs or robotic labs. And this, of course, raises questions about how is oversight provided in a world in which an LLM model feeds a script to a robot and a product is made and sent through the mail. I had the fortune, I think, of being asked to red team some of the frontier models this past year for some of the leading frontier AI companies. And I was asked specifically, perhaps to do what Nate Gross just suggested, to go deep on the possible ability to use a model, but in this case, to do harm. I was asked to see if these models could enable someone moderately skilled in the art to develop a biological agent that could kill millions of people. And the answer, perhaps not surprisingly to many of you, is that yes, they can. And they can in ways that are highly credible, and ways in which would be very difficult to counter in real time should we have to face this possibility. What to me was most shocking was the ability of these models to come up with creative, even cunning plans on how to deploy such agents and maximize harm, even when not prompted to provide this information. A news outlet in the UK fed that newspaper article to ChatGPT and asked it to come up with an image, and although it's quite entertaining, there's a fundamental flaw here, which is that it is suggesting that the near-term actor will be the model or the AI. It will not be. It will be a human. And it may today require it to be a human with moderate skills, but tomorrow, someone with somewhat lesser skills. So it comes down to a very crude and simple question: how unlikely, and there are certainly uncertainties here, but how unlikely does it need to be for a calamitous outcome to be tolerated despite the possibility of a large and maybe even probable near-term benefit? This is a question that I think very few people are willing to confront and sit down and deal with in a sober fashion. And it's especially problematic when we don't have a meaningful governance plan. So it's not for lack of trying, and there are certainly great ideas out there about how we would govern this kind of risk. The Nuclear Threat Initiative on the left, RAND Corporation on the right, many others have very interesting, useful ideas, and I urge you to take a look at these. And we even know what the features of an effective governance plan should look like. There should be a proper risk-benefit assessment. There should be both top-down and bottom-up governance structure, soft power, hard power, access controls, an adaptive feature where the governance system learns and evolves, but most importantly, shared responsibility, not just for the developers of the technology and the users, but for the rest of the public. And I just want to end with a few comments about that. This book appeared 100 years ago, and it was published by a sociologist named William Ogburn. And what Ogburn introduces in this book is the idea of something called cultural lag, which is the time delay between the advent of a new technology and the time at which the rest of society fully recognizes the impact of that technology and what to do about it. In his day, it was factory automation and the near-term reality of worker injuries in a factory where there hadn't been prior consideration of the right governance needed, the right regulation. And he challenges us to think about how would we close this gap, address the period of maladjustment. Now, this is 100 years ago, and you can ask, how much has changed and how little has changed? So I'll end you with this. In thinking about this period of maladjustment, we're going to either have to speed up the back end, the societal response to a technology, by allowing it to anticipate it better, or we're going to have to slow down the front end, which is the technology. And I know that's a bad word around here, but I'm going to tell you that there is no other way I can see for humans like all of us to grapple with technology as complicated as this and come up with meaningful, truly holistic governance schemes without slowing down that technology, at least its rollout. And finally, There has to be meaningful public discussion. There's something called deliberative democratic processes. We need to reread what that means and engage our public in ways that we haven't, because if we do not, I will tell you that most people out there on the street are deeply skeptical and worried about not just the implications for medicine, but the implications through science and for the rest of us. And if it's not properly addressed, their concerns, we will be in a whole deep pot of trouble. Thank you.